everybody. I'm Melanie Penn, and welcome to the Rising Podcast. Today, we're talking with Dr. Joel Elowsky. Actually, the Reverend Dr. Joel Elowsky. He is a distinguished theologian and currently a professor at Concordia University, and he's very well known for his work as the research director of the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture. That's a lot of big words, and I know that I thought the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture sounded so fancy, but it's actually one of the best resources I have found to accompany my own Bible reading and learn about the history of the Bible. So the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture is a resource through which every single verse in the Bible, you can reference what the early church fathers said about that particular verse. And it's an amazing treasure trove of where our faith has come from. So we're going to talk to Dr. Elowsky today and talk about the resurrection, his work in the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture, and a bunch of other things. We're going to pursue all sorts of Bible nerdery, which is my favorite sort of Bible nerdery. So join me to talk with Dr. Joel Elowsky. Joel, would you tell us a little bit about who you are, what institutions you've been a part of, and where you are now?
Sure. Well, I actually started out as a mission developer. I started a church outside of Atlantic City. So that was the start of my, I don't want to say professional career, but my calling. Then I went up to Drew University for 10 years to serve with Tom Oden on the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture. Then I went to Concordia University, Wisconsin for 4 years. So I got university experience for a bit more. And then I ended up here at Concordia Seminary for the last 10, 11 years, where I teach church history and also am dean of the graduate school too. And then out of the commentary grew the African Project because we noticed that there were all these, church fathers who were from Africa, but we didn't know if our African friends knew about it. So we decided to start the Center for Early African Christianity. And so that's based in New Haven, right across from Yale Divinity School.
So the Center for Early African Christianity was an outgrowth from the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture.
Yeah, that's correct. Right.
And can you, just for the average person, the average Bible reader, if there is such a thing, say a little bit about what is the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture? How did it come about? What is it? It's such a treasured resource. I can't believe that I didn't know about it earlier.
Well, I mean, it's the vision of Tom Oden, who was a wonderful friend for 20 years. But it's this idea that we should be more familiar with how the church has read Scripture. I think historically, it's good to, especially in our 21st century, to have some context for what we're reading. And so the idea of the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture was to make these comments available for lay people. We could have put a lot of highfalutin language and other things in there, but what we decided to do was make these quotes from the fathers so that you could read them devotionally, you could read them along with your scripture, maybe even use them in sermons or Bible studies.
I'd also love, I can do it too, but again, for the average person, I think the format of the Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture, the name is very weighty. It sounds so serious, but then you open up a volume and you realize how accessible it is. Even the layout, like how the font looks, is so welcoming. And can you just say a little bit about, yes, you wanted this to be a resource for a normal person to read the Bible and have like a companion. Can you say a little bit about how you decided about the format, how you decided, even the fact that it goes verse by verse, you can kind of follow along. I would love to know the thought behind it and how it came to be.
Well, there was actually some debate about this, because there were two different schools of thought of what we should do. There was the academic side that wanted to give these big, huge, extended sections and just kind of group them together. But we kind of thought that that's not what the average person, how they read the Bible. It'd be good for us. It's how scholars read, but, and the other thing that we had a debate about was even the layout on the page, because if you go back to the Jewish tradition, you look at the Talmud, like from the 5th century, there's actually a small little text in the middle and then commentary around it. And we thought about that, and that is actually how some of the Bibles in the Middle Ages looked. But the publisher said that would be too difficult to lay out on the page at the time. So we just decided the most important way to do it then is verse by verse, so that we could show how the church really did come in on all of Scripture that way.
It is amazing. You really can make it a devotional. Like if you were to read a passage in your, quiet time or devotional, however people say it, and then look at the ancient Christian commentary on Scripture, and it's right there. You don't have to go through 1,000 pages of Augustine to find what Augustine said about that exact verse. It really is incredible. And even when I read it, I feel like I'm kind of reaching back through the ages, to like the forefathers in my faith, to be like, well, what did they say? And it's just really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Our pleasure. And it was a labor of love. It's 29 volumes, and basically, yeah.
I'm going to hold one up for people. Here's
all
one
right.
of them.
Perfect.
Just beautiful.
There, you can kind of see it. Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. And of course, we had to make selections, too. We couldn't put everything in. So what we were looking to do was what would feed spiritual life, what would also help people understand how this text, was read 2,000 years ago. So, yeah.
So I think you might know this. I did a Christmas project where I wrote just like super accessible songs based on the scriptures around the Nativity. And
I got to hear you sing. It was wonderful.
Thank you. And you've been so helpful, kind of my verifying some of my research on it. And I think you know this, but just to reiterate, I'm about to launch a similar project that is about the resurrection. One of the songs is from the perspective of Mary Magdalene in the garden, talking to the gardener, and then recognizing that the gardener is Jesus. And as you know, that's only in the Gospel of John. Why? And I so appreciate all of the passages, all of the sections in your John volume about that encounter with Mary and the gardener. Why do we know why John included that and no one else did? I mean, do you think that John and Mary had a special relationship, or do you think that John was the only one that thought it was powerful or meaningful enough to be included? Like, what would you surmise why it's included in John and nowhere else?
Well, I wish I could ask him, first.
No, I know.
You're right. It would be fun. But, that's an interesting question, because John has a number of things he includes that the other three Gospels don't. For instance, the woman caught in adultery, as well in John 8, right? So when you start thinking about that, I think he's in some ways trying to show that there is redemption, for even the worst of sinners, and that they can, and she even gets to have one of the first encounters with the resurrected Lord. I mean, that's pretty amazing, right? Just there. But then even in the conversations, she's just so full of joy, or incredulous that she can't even see who this is she's talking to, and she thinks he's the gardener. That to me is just amazing. That until she finally identifies who he is, then she's like, oh, it's my Lord, and you can see that relationship between the two.
It's kind of interesting to think about. Did she just disclose more to him? I don't know. Because it is kind of radical that John includes it and no one else does.
That's true. And the other thing about John is there's this book by Wenham. It's called Easter Enigma. So
yes.
This book, he establishes all these connections, even relationship-wise, also business-wise, that a lot of these characters in the Gospels had with each other. So the fact that he included her perhaps means that she kind of became a part of this. Who knows? But yeah, there are those kind of connections, very much so.
I was very touched, there's a lot of things that get illuminated in the ancient Christian commentary on scripture that you wouldn't get from like a modern commentator. There was one comment about how the angels ask a question of Mary. The angels say, "Why are you weeping?" And they could have just come right out and kind of blasted her with the news, right? Like, Christ is risen. And instead, they choose to ask her a question. And was the question an act of gentle love for her? Like, not to blow her away with this incredible news that Christ had risen, but just to gently ask a question. And it made me think, like, are questions kind of fundamental to how God approaches mankind? Like, gentle questions, kind of bringing us into the conversation as opposed to just like blasting us away.
Yeah, which he could very easily do, right? And then so could those angels, for that matter. And I think you're onto something there. And of course, think about one of the first encounters we hear that God has with human beings, right? It's in the Garden of Eden, another garden, shall we say. So you get the garden there, and you get the garden here, and you're going to get another garden at the end of time, right? But he comes walking in the cool of the day and says, "Where are you, Adam?" It's a question. And did you eat the fruit? He gives him a chance, to come clean on things, right? And I think that's God's way. We know he's a judge, yes, but we also know that he brought us into being, so he wants us to be with him forever. So he gives us opportunity through questions to, invite us into a conversation with him, like prayer is.
Yeah, it makes one think, like, wow, to actually get the question, you have to be listening first. Yeah. It's like if God's asking you a question, you better be tuned in somehow to like hear the question you're being asked. That's
right. And she was even there at the tomb. I mean, that says something too, right? They all showed up there. They were expecting just to do the spices, but it showed a deep reverence and respect for her Lord too when she's there. Yeah.
Well, and something in the ancient Christian commentary on scripture helped illuminate for me is the fact that Mary got to the tomb and didn't understand immediately that it meant Christ was risen, almost as part of the proof text, because she never even thought, it was never even remotely in her mind that resurrection would have been a possibility. And it kind of goes to show, like, at the time, they couldn't have made this up. They weren't thinking about it. It didn't even come into their minds as a possibility. So, like, how can you fabricate a lie that you wouldn't have even thought of?
Yeah, and the Gospels are brutally honest in this, that they report the ignorance and questioning of the disciples too, right?
Yeah, it says some doubted. It says the resurrected Christ appeared to them, and some still doubted.
Yeah, I mean, there's some real tragic kind of things when you look at it, except as you say, it is the opportunity then for faith to be expressed in a way that you can't contradict that, right? Yeah.
Are there things, as you were researching, especially those John passages of the resurrection and any other passages on the resurrection, that struck you in a new way, that stuck with you?
Yeah. For me, always with John, it's the crucifixion too. I will say, when he talks about the water and blood coming out, there was all kinds of stuff I learned with that, which is, it was the birth of the church, this kind of stuff, tying it back to Eve. It's interesting that Christ's side is pierced. They didn't pierce his heart. They didn't, it's his side, right? And the fathers made a big deal about this because they go back to Genesis and they said, how did God bring Eve into being? Well, he brought her into being from the side of Adam. And he brought her out from there. And so they say, just as Eve was born as shall we say, it was the birth of the human race. So when Christ's side is pierced, it's the birth of the church, because they're out of his side pour water and blood. And I mean, John's the only one who mentions that, right? And he's that detailed about it, This is one of the things I like to teach evangelicals about, is the fact that the sacraments were actually pretty important in the life of the church. They weren't kind of add-ons. They were God's delivery system of his means of grace, his forgiveness, So, that's what one of the things you learn from the church that way at the early ages.
In ancient Christian commentary on Scripture, in the John 19 and 20 sections, I had never thought of before that the idea that the work of the resurrection happened on the Sabbath day. And after the Sabbath, Mary discovers the tomb. And is that right? I think I read that right.
Yeah, in John's gospel, especially since he's writing from a Jewish perspective, we have to remember that the day starts with the evening, It's just like in Genesis, when you read it was evening and morning the first day, evening and morning the second day. So Sunday started in the evening of Saturday, we could say, after sunset. So if you mean in that sense, then it's true, yeah. But that he rose early on the first day of the week, as we say too, which was Sunday. So he's crucified on Friday. He's in the tomb on Saturday. He's raised on Sunday, but it was very early. So, as I say, with John's calendar, it would start on Saturday nights, Sunday morning. I've taken it the day we rest is the day he rests too, just like God rested on the seventh day. So every Sabbath there's rest, and there's always rest. But the interesting thing that maybe you're thinking about is that he descended to Hades or hell, to proclaim victory. And, we know he did that at some point before he rose from the dead. And they do talk about that quite a bit. There's all these poetic sermons where he's going down to hell and saying, release the captives, and the Tartarus is pushing back. No, they're ours. And then he says, but I paid the price. And I mean, it's this beautiful dialogue between the two. And, we don't, what's interesting is we don't know the exact time he rose from the dead, because the text doesn't tell us, and I think the fathers would know that. But they would have seen him already. Yeah, probably. Like I said, it began on that Saturday evening. In that sense, we can say so that much.
Definitely, something was going on during the Sabbath.
Yeah.
Something was happening.
Something definitely was happening. He must have been maybe opening the prison doors, something like that. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I suppose.
What do you make of, and again, these are things that just happen in John. So Mary recognizes Jesus and they have this lovely conversation, beautiful conversation. And then Jesus says, don't touch me. Don't cling to me because I haven't yet ascended to the Father. But then Thomas and Jesus have an exchange, and he does allow Thomas to touch him. And what do you make of that difference? And I have a thought, but it's just kind of making it up. What do you think about that? That Jesus is so instructive of Mary, don't touch me, and then instructive of Thomas to touch him.
Yeah, well, because there were different instances, purposes in those encounters. With Thomas, it was basically, and by the way, it happens a week later kind of thing, but that doesn't make that much difference. And here's something interesting, that when Ephraim the Syrian talks about Thomas touching Jesus, putting his hand in his side, he says, what protected him from, being destroyed? Because you're encountering God, right? He said, and the fire should have burned his hand, but it doesn't, because he's also human. But yeah, with Mary, this is one of those enigmatic passages that the fathers don't necessarily even agree. They'll talk about different ideas about it, but it's this idea that he had not yet ascended to the Father, that she wasn't ready for it, almost kind of thing. That don't touch me didn't mean that she was unclean. But the fathers kind of intuit that she just didn't have the the full understanding yet to be able to encounter him, I guess, in that way. As I look at this, this next section, they would say, some of them would say, she just didn't know enough yet. and then he would let her do it. And with Thomas, it was kind of the opportunity to teach, right? So that's why he allows it. I'll be honest with you. When I was choosing these selections, I was kind of surprised they were kind of all over the place in terms of, trying to understand what this is about, because it's one of those passages where Jesus doesn't explain it. He just says, don't do it, and that seems to be enough. And so they're going to spiritualize this to say, well, that we touch him by faith, but we don't get to touch him physically, these kind of things. So that's kind of what happens.
I wondered, I kind of like that the gospel writers leave things out, because I think in some ways it's in a loving way, giving us, again, like asking the question, like it's giving us opportunity to kind of, with our sacred imagination, just wonder, like meditate on some things and wonder. And I kind of wondered, well, Thomas doubted, like Thomas needed that physical touch, and maybe Mary didn't. Yeah. And so there's allowances. Are there allowances for people where they are? And does God, allow different things at different moments, depending on like what we need to overcome our doubts? I don't know. It was just a question, because that is the difference between Thomas and Mary.
That is, yeah, and the fact that too, don't overlook the fact that it is women who first get to see him resurrected, and then they go tell the disciples, right. And then the disciples are like, well, I don't know if we could even believe this, but I see John emphasizing the fact that God has an important place for women in the life of the church, and to give them the honor of being the first witnesses. That's pretty amazing to me too, and especially somebody like Mary, she gets to encounter him. So I think you're right about that there is something in the encounter itself that says to you or to me, no, maybe at this time I can't handle what's going on, but I'll get to figure it out. Or God will help me figure it out, giving me His Spirit, right? Yeah, I like that.
Another thing in the commentary, which I hadn't heard as much, because I've been reading some modern writers, about the Easter events, and I had never really heard anyone talk about the fact that there's linens left behind, in the sense that the linens actually are proof of the resurrection. The fact that the writers mention the linens, because it would have been a very time-consuming process to take the linens off of the body, to kind of like undo that embalming process.
Yeah, you'd have to unwrap them. Yeah.
Yeah, can you say more about that detail and like why it is so significant?
Well, it's proof of the resurrection for sure, because they're not only there, but they're folded, right? And they talk about them being at the head and at the feet, and of course, the fathers will even take this to another level, and they'll bring it back to worship and talk about the altar, where you place linens on the altar, which we do in our tradition. I don't know I think you might too, that this is kind of going back to that resurrection too, that we have the linens there for not only to protect the wood, shall we say, or surface, but it's really to take you back to that tomb and recognize that he's risen from the dead. And so when the angels even talk about that at the head and the feet and these kind of things, they'll talk about how revelation works and things like that. So it's a fine little detail like that, right? We just skip over that, I think, and they look at it and they see all kinds of significance, in that. I go back again to the cross, when they have since we're talking about linens, they had the tunic of Jesus, right? The robe that he wore. And remember what happened with that the soldiers didn't rip it in two. They cast lots for it. And the church saw huge significance in that. Why wouldn't God let the soldiers rip that tunic? And they said, well, it's of course because God wanted to teach us about unity in the church. And I said, really? And then, yeah, because, he easily could have let them do it, but he didn't, because that, just like that seamless robe of Christ, the church is called to be not divided, but together as one. And that this was kind of God's way of saying, I want a church that is one, united together.
You hinted at it a little bit, that there were two angels, and the early church fathers saw significance in the two angels. There's an angel at the foot and the feet. Give us the Angels for Dummies version of why the two angels at the tomb was significant.
Yeah, the two angels in white. Yeah. Why is one sitting at the head and the other at the feet, Augustine asks? Was it because those who are in Greek are called angels aren't Latin news bearers? Well, okay, possibly. But Gregory the Great sees anytime they think of the number two, and they do this with lots of numbers, by the way, they think in Old Testament, New Testament. This is a way of talking about that, I suppose. So, they're showing that both testaments come together. And this is, again, they're reading the Bible to try to speak to their situation where they're trying to show the unity of Scripture, that there is one book, but it's in two sections. Well, just like Christ is one person, but in two natures, they would make these kind of connections, which, again, is a different way of reading. But it's one that's meant to feed the faith of the people, to say, you can read the Old Testament, and you can also see Christ in it. And the tomb proves that with the two angels.
Have you ever thought about, do angels appear again? Is it the same angels who God kind of dispatches to the tomb to be like, you know what? You don't have to guard the gates of Eden anymore. I'm going to send you to the tomb. You get to be the ones to tell Mary that Christ is risen, What's it like to see thousands of years of God's work and have a role in news bearing different things over time? That must be quite a career.
Yeah. Wow. I like you're reading like the church fathers here,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, you're making those connections. That Eden is now open, right? Because paradise is open, and that symbolism, there's nothing to speak against it. Yeah, good for you.
Yeah, it's a room to wonder. I love that about it. I love the room to wonder, and I think it's cool to encourage people in their holy lives, in their pursuit of holiness. It's okay to wonder the things that happen. What would you say to just someone who wants to go deeper and access the writings of the church fathers? Where's a good place to start? Would you say Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture, or would you say one writer in particular? And what could that process be? Just because not everyone's an academic person,
Yeah.
You've got people just kind of doing their jobs, living their lives, and we don't have the time to devote ourselves to study.
Yeah. That's kind of why we did the Ancient Christian Commentary the way we did, because we recognize that, and so I do think it's a good place to start. We also have another series called Ancient Christian Doctrine, for those who might want to go through the Nicene Creed, and we do it the same way, that kind of give you an introduction. So I think those two, but where I usually start people off is with a book by Athanasius. It's called On the Incarnation. And this was a book that C.S. Lewis wrote in a modern translation, wrote the foreword for it. So he, it's a pretty important book in understanding why did God become human? And it's written, you got to find a modern translation. Because most people, when they encounter the church fathers, they go online and they take the first thing they see and they say, I can't understand this. And I said, I can't either. You need good modern translations that will actually make the fathers come alive. Yeah, I think the series Popular Patristics is published by St. Vladimir's Press. They're not expensive and they're accessible.
And are there any, obviously you're immersed in the church fathers. Are there modern theologians that you read, modern historians that you direct people to?
Well,
aside from yourself.
Yeah. And of course I come from the Lutheran tradition. So, a lot of our Lutheran, teachers are familiar with the fathers. Tom Oden, his works are really important. So he was converted by the church fathers in the sense that, he used to think scripture was all myth, or just stories and things that weren't really true. And one of his colleagues told him he should read his own tradition and then come and talk to him. So when he read the church fathers, he started to realize that all this stuff he had kind of believed was not true actually is, and so he was convicted, shall we say. And so Tom dedicated the rest of his life to making the fathers accessible for people to read, and so he's got this systematic theology that he wrote that has the church fathers all over the place. And we actually have it on our website, Institute for Classical Christian Studies. Yeah, and you can actually read it for free online. And, his one volume, Ancient Christianity, I think we call it. I think what I learned from Tom was to recognize that we need to immerse ourselves in the fathers, not to take us away from Scripture, but actually to help us even get more focused on Scripture, because we both would recognize that, what's the whole focus of the Christian life? It's Scripture that informs our Christian life. Without that, you can read all the church fathers you want, but they're going to teach you how to read Scripture in a way that's going to feed your faith. And so, he was the vision behind all of this, and that's why we miss him. A good friend of Howard and Roberta's too. So I would recommend his systematic theology too, which is, like I said, now in one volume.
Do you think a non-academic person can read systematic theology and get something out of it?
With his, I think they can. I think there are some that are impenetrable, but there are, I think he writes it in such a way that he actually also becomes devotional, even in a sense that way. And it's published with Harper One. That's right. The new one is.
Just in closing, I would love if you'd share a little bit about, like, you personally, what this has meant to you, and do you find that you're still discovering new things, and what's, the latest thing you've kind of uncovered as you've gone back in time, to our church fathers? Like, is there something that comes to your mind that you've just kind of found again, so to say?
Yeah, well, every time I read the fathers, I come up with something new, shall we say. And especially, lately, I've been looking a lot at the Desert Fathers. You asked about people to read. Christopher Hall's another person to read. And so I've been doing a bunch with we call it the passions, what moves the soul kind of thing. And I've been doing this with the Desert Fathers and learning quite a bit, and also trying to teach our seminarians here that it's important to be able to figure these things out and go into your ministry ready, because the attacks are going to come. And the desert dwellers, fathers and mothers too, by the way, I've been learning a lot from them about how to live a Christian life, and I think they'd find it helpful, and I know I do.
Well, that's a whole other episode, I think.
I think you're right.
Thank you so much for being a part of this, and just God bless you in your work. Thank you for all you're doing.
Well, thank you, and good to get to see you again virtually.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to the Rising podcast as we look further into the resurrection of Jesus. Did you know The Rising is also an album? The Rising is an album that I wrote that tells the story of Christ's resurrection. Each song on the album is written from a different perspective of someone who was actually there at the resurrection. Each guest on The Rising also has a perspective. And you know what? So do you. I would venture to say that your perspective is the one that I'm most interested in. Would so love it if you'd subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, and you can find new episodes on any of those platforms as well. If you want to get to know me better, you can find me on Instagram or go to melaniepenn.com and you can send me a message there. I make things for you, and I'm so glad that you are here for The Rising.